And we are live. Welcome to the World Anvil live stream today. Unfortunately, Janet cannot be with you. She is suffering from a terrible migraine. But you have me, Kat, your content queen, ready to talk dark fairy tales, folklore, urban legends, and transmedia storytelling with the inimitable Gregg Hale, best known from the Blair Witch Project. Okay, so Gregg Hale grew up an unabashed Star Wars fan, avid Dungeons and Dragons player, and a backyard zombie filmmaker. He worked as a set dresser and prop man on movies and TV shows in Orlando and LA for 10 years before producing the Blair Witch Project in 1999. Since then, Gregg has written, produced, and/or directed 10 feature films, 4 television series and specials, dozens of commercials, and hundreds of creative elements, including comic books, video games, traditional advertising pieces, live events, and theme park rides. His work has garnered an Independent Spirit Award, the Prix de la Jeunesse from Cannes, a Nova Award from the Producers Guild, a Cannes Bronze Lion, and multiple Mix, Clio, Effie, and Addy Awards. Gregg is currently the creative director, and producer of Emerald Anvil, a multi-platform fantasy story world that includes a novel, a board game, a podcast, and an interactive storytelling NFT activation. So I am going to bring up Gregg.
Hello.
So Gregg is here with us today because they have just launched Emerald Anvil, and the first piece of that, I believe, is the podcast Black Velvet Fairies, right?
That's right. Yep. Black Velvet Fairies. First episode dropped Tuesday, March 19th.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So what would you like to tell us about Emerald Anvil / Black Velvet Fairies to kind of set the stage for our conversation today?
Well, I mean, definitely Emerald Anvil definitely fits into World Anvil from a world building standpoint. Emerald Anvil is a fantasy story world set on a dangerous fairy planet called Hada. And we're exploring this dangerous fairy realm initially through 4 different media, 4 different platforms. Like you just said, a podcast, a board game, a novel, and then an interactive NFT storytelling game. And definitely looked at this from the very beginning as a multi-platform world, and definitely looked at it as a world, right? As a universe that we wanted to explore in all these different ways.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. So I have some questions prepared because I like to do my homework when I'm going to be running the stream instead of Janet. So I wanted to first jump into the idea of how do you approach a multimedia or transmedia by design world building project like Emerald Anvil? A lot of times a world building project becomes multimedia after like a novel or a movie or a film or something like that, or a game becomes big, and then sort of the IP kind of takes on a life of its own. So how do you approach it differently when you're going into it from the jump, assuming that it has to work for multiple different platforms and media?
Yeah, I mean, I think because of like why I'm a filmmaker and how I got into the industry. I'm 58. I was 11 years old when Star Wars came out, the original OG Star Wars. That is absolutely why I want to be a filmmaker, why I got into film. Same with Eduardo Sanchez, my partner, in everything, including Emerald Anvil. But even when I was a kid, I never looked at Star Wars as just a film. Obviously, the film was the focus, but I always thought about Star Wars as a story that I was accessing in all these different ways, whether that was through the action figures or comic books or the albums that they put out at the beginning. I always looked at it. I didn't know what multimedia was or multi-platform, obviously, but that's the way I thought about Star Wars, right? It wasn't just the movie. And I got into Dungeons and Dragons very shortly after that, at 13.
The world building way drug.
Yeah, exactly. And Dungeons and Dragons, obviously is all about world building, right? And gives you tools for that and starts to train you as a storyteller to think about stories, not just as one singular expression, but here's this world. And in the case of Dungeons and Dragons, here's this world that my characters the players are going to explore, right? And I think that I've just translated that approach to everything. So when we started doing Blair Witch, I think naturally Ed and I kind of coming at it from that Star Wars perspective, we're like, yeah, of course we're going to make a movie, but we have all these other aspects of the story that we want to tell, backstory, the deep backstory of the legend and the lore and stuff about Blair Witch. And that's really why we put the website up. Ed happened to have the ability to code websites, which back in the day was rare. So
in 99 it was for sure.
yeah. I mean, it was really so much serendipity, so much luck, so much right place, right time. So we started putting this kind of, I guess you could call it like the Blair Witch expanded universe, I suppose, the story world. We started putting that online, not really as like marketing, as a marketing ploy. It turned into marketing, but it started as really as storytelling, right? We were trying to put stories out in front of people and get the audience involved, and then use that storytelling to drive people toward watching the movie, or watching the TV special or whatever. So Blair Witch was definitely multi-platform from the very beginning. It was like, we didn't think about it that way. It just felt natural, right? Mm-hmm. We did that with our other movies. We've done some multimedia stuff with Lovely Molly. I did a TV show for Fox called Freaky Links, which was about a paranormal investigator that had a huge backlog of content that you could find on the internet.
Oh, I remember Freaky Links.
Yeah. So we've always approached our storytelling that way. But with Emerald Anvil, we really wanted to kind of formalize it. And also, one of the aspects of the multi-platform approach that we're trying to employ, this is a completely independent project. We raised the money ourselves. We're kind of going back to the OG roots of like how we did Blair Witch, right? Independent financing, doing it ourselves. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is creative control, obviously. Another is that we maintain ownership of it, right? If it becomes successful, then we own it. But what the multi-platform allows us to do, because we are independent and we don't have $200 million to make a movie or make a TV series, and so we have to approach it from, okay, what are some platforms that we can afford to do, right? A podcast, a narrative podcast, relatively inexpensive platform. A board game, especially kickstarting it the way we're doing it, relatively inexpensive way of telling part of the story. Same with the novel, and same with the NFT activation, right? It's a lot of sweat equity. We've got a lot of partners, super talented partners in all these areas that are helping us tell these stories. So we're giving up some ownership and some participation with our sweat equity partners, but doing it with platforms that are so much more affordable than, clearly a TV show or a movie or even a platform video game, or even just a video game, a mobile video game, are incredibly expensive now.
It's an interesting ground up way to kind of do world building first, narrative storytelling, and to kind of create those sort of minimum viable product, the MVP versions of your world and things, and kind of whet people's appetite with it before that, in the hopes that can eventually like grow into something bigger. That's a really interesting approach, I think.
Yeah, exactly. You got it. And honestly, it's weird because, like I said, I've kind of, Ed and I've always thought about stories kind of naturally in this way. And I think people are used to interacting with stories in this way, but when we've just launched, right, the website has only been live for a couple of weeks, emeraldanvil.com. And, but people go there and they're like, well, what is this? Right. It's a little confusing. So our approach, to come back to your basic question, sorry, I digressed quite a bit. The approach is, we try to look at it just from a storytelling perspective. What story do we want to tell, and what are the medias or platforms that we can tell that story through? Mm-hmm. And then we try to do the best job that we can in each of those media, right? So I think the podcast is really good. We got a great writer director, Jamie Nash, who has written basically all of our movies, or co-written all of our movies with us. Gretchen Lodge from Lovely Molly playing the lead. She's amazing. Chris Osborne from Exist, our Bigfoot movie, is playing her best friend, James. Just across the board, really, really, PRX is distributing it. So across the board, like a really high level, world-class piece of content. And that's kind of how we're trying to approach everything, right? Like put quality things in front of people that they're going to enjoy. That's not just marketing, and build an audience through really legitimately, trying to please them, right? Trying to give them stuff that they're going to like. I think that's the most important part of the approach.
Just that interactive, immersive storytelling, like Dungeons and Dragons, where you're pulling people into the story. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Kind of to build onto that, wanted to talk about like folklore and urban legends and things like that. And I know that there's some of this around both Blair Witch Project and your current project.
Yeah.
So folklore and urban legends typically rely on like local myths and legends and superstitions and things like that. And how do you research and use this kind of oral history and background information in your world building and storytelling?
Well, with Blair Witch, Blair Witch absolutely was built on oral tradition storytelling, right? Where I'm from, and I think where you're from, Kentucky, Tennessee, there's the Bell Witch. Which is, and I think there's different versions of the Bell Witch depending on where you're from. So that, I think that's a really old school influence. But in a way, like one of the big influential movies on Blair Witch was Legend of Boggy Creek, which was a kind of a faux documentary, mockumentary, whatever term you want to use, about Bigfoot, or a Bigfoot-like creature. And that movie, I think it came out, people are going to hate me, 72, 73, something like that. I saw it when I was a kid. It freaked me out. But a movie like Boggy Creek back then became part of the lore, right? It became an urban legend, right? Because it's supporting this idea of Bigfoot, right? In Search Of was another big influence on us. And In Search Of was basically just a TV show that brought different legends and lore and superstitions and myths and stuff to life, right? Through an investigative lens. So all those things were hugely influential on Blair Witch. Was there research involved? At some point, yes, of course. When we're trying to tell the backstory of Ellie Kedward, like the original witch, we researched, the old witch trials and how all that kind of stuff worked, and tried to make that fit with, with the real world, right? Blair Witch always had this, is it real approach. And with Emerald Anvil, and especially the podcast, Black Velvet Fairies, there is also a, is it real approach, right? Because the podcast is fictional narrative podcast, but we present it like it's an actual audio diary of this woman who's experiencing this kind of supernatural stuff happening to her. Her grandmother dies, leaves her these 4 black velvet paintings of fairies. Kind of starts out, this is weird, let me dig into it. And as she digs into it, she finds out that her family has all these weird, strange, kind of supernatural connections to not only the paintings, but this fairy world that the paintings apparently represent. So there's witchcraft crossover, there's fae lore and legend crossover, there's paranormal crossover. And from a research perspective and a urban legend approach, the way we're handling that in the podcast is just the way a podcast person would do it. I found these weird black velvet paintings about fairies. Let me find a fairy expert to get on, right? So we have a real fairy expert, John Cruz, who's written like a dozen books about fairies in England. He gets on and he's our expert on fairies. We have a witchcraft expert come on from Witchcraft in the United States, a podcast where she gets on and talks about real witchcraft related to fae and fae lore. There's some paranormal stuff. Greg Newkirk comes on, right? So it's like, who's a huge paranormal investigator. So we're trying to do that thing of connecting our fictional story with the real world in a tangible way. So you can enjoy our story fictionally, but you could also go out and, you know, listen to Heather's podcast about witchcraft and get real information, or read John Cruise's books about fairies and get real information, or, you know, look at all the stuff that Greg Newkirk is doing with paranormal and connect our narrative story to the real world. And then there's stuff that's going to happen later where we actually do have real paintings. We have things that actually are going to happen in the real world, connection to the physical world. When we were before we got on and you and I were chatting, you've got some experience in your past from working on ARGs, alternate reality games.
Alternate reality games,
yeah, which like you're saying, kind of that term is kind of fallen out of favor, but I still think it happens all the time. And me and Mike Manello, who's also works on Emerald Anvil, one of the executive producers of Black Velvet Fairies, we started a company, I don't know, a long time ago called Campfire. That all our early stuff was an advertising agency, and a lot of what we did early were like sponsored ARGs. Basically, you know, we did one for Sega, we did one for Audi, we did a bunch of them. So that kind of like crossover into the real world is an ARG thing, and we're gonna have that with Emerald Anvil, especially with Black Velvet Fairies.
That is really cool. I like the way that you're like weaving in real world experts with a fictional narrative, so that it sort of blurs the line between what is myth, what is genuine information, that kind of thing, and kind of yeah, you're right. I got to work on some ARGs back in my ad agency days. I also was very involved in the Lost experience because I was a huge Lost fan when that first came out, and that was another thing that sort of. And the nice thing about it is it's very immersive. It just creates this world that's engaging, that you just want to like dive into, and you feel like it could literally go on forever if you kept digging.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very deep lore and very deep world building in that respect, and that's very cool. So gonna move on to some of our other questions here, because we only have an hour. Well, I would pick your brain forever. This is kind of touching on that same thing before, but it's kind of from a different angle. This kind of storytelling often drives on that sense of ambiguity, like what really happened and what's embellished or imagined. How do you maintain mystery while also keeping the story clear? How do you keep the narrative from kind of going off the rails on these like different tangents?
Well, you know, that's a super interesting question when you're talking about things from a world building perspective, right? Where part of world building is, especially in Dungeons and Dragons, yes, you drive the narrative, you control the narrative, but to a certain degree, your players can go off on a tangent, right?
And do very, very often. Yes.
They very often do, right? It's like playing Skyrim or whatever, and never doing the main quest, right? Just roaming around and doing side quests and shooting guys in the knee with arrows or whatever.
That's my husband's preferred way to play Skyrim.
Yeah, right.
Never touch the main quest.
Yeah, so I think from a world building perspective, the storytelling aspect is interesting because, like with Emerald Anvil, we're telling 4 distinct standalone stories that are also interconnected, right? So we try to control the narrative of those 4 things, right? Those are fixed pieces of media. By and large, we'll talk about the NFT thing later because that's completely interactive and I think super cool the way we're doing it. So, you know, I think that the storytelling rules of how you build that story and drive the story, you know, are the basic storytelling rules that would apply to anything. I don't know that. I do think with horror in general, Blair Witch really proved that it's not so much what you see as what you don't see, right?
The corner of your eye stuff, and
So I think that that sense of ambiguity, to go to your question, the sense of ambiguity helps you a lot of times in horror, right? Not being clear, not spelling everything out. That's absolutely a part of Black Velvet Fairies, in that it's mysterious, right? And the characters exploring this mystery. And then what we're trying to do as a storyteller, because it's 13 episodes, and really as a storyteller, what we're trying to do is, like, have interesting stuff happen during each episode, and driving to some sort of conclusion that works as a cliffhanger, right?
Yeah.
So not solve the mystery, but if you do solve a part of the mystery, you're putting the next puzzle piece in front of them to make the audience want to come in and see what happens next. Do we always keep the story clear, to your question? I don't know. I mean, if I knew the answer to that, I probably wouldn't have to independently finance Emerald Anvil.
That's really a greater question around episodic storytelling in general, like television, comic books, all those kind of media that don't have a fixed endpoint. You were talking about fixed points in the narrative, but like if you're building out to, and I like that idea of like each end you get resolution, but it sets up a cliffhanger for the next mystery. And I think that's a really interesting way to approach keeping a clear narrative thread while still like leaving the path open for additional storytelling opportunities. And I think that's pretty neat.
Yeah. And I think with world building specifically, like in the novel, you got to strike this balance between answering questions about the world that make it interesting and flesh it out, but maintaining a sense of there's other stuff to discover, right? And not try to spend all your time in every scene of the novel explaining some aspect of this fairy world, right? Yeah. There are parts that become relevant, and you try to explain it, and you do it in a way that gives your audience confidence that you know what you're talking about, so that they understand that there's a mystery, but they're confident enough in you as a storyteller that they have faith that you're eventually going to tell them what they need to know when they need to know it, right?
Yeah. Giving the idea that it keeps extending past the frame makes me think of in your bio you mentioned that you worked on theme park rides, and that's something that like you have to really master in world building, is like creating this sense that like the ride continues on past your line of sight, that there's that creating that suspension of disbelief that you really are in, Skull Island, for example, if you're
right. Yeah, actually, I wrote the script. I was one of the main writers for the Ant-Man ride in Hong Kong. So with that, obviously, you're tapping into the issue that you deal with when you're writing a ride for Marvel is not so much like the suspension of disbelief, because there's such a giant world that you're tapping into, but it's like, how do you limit what you're showing because you're only a theme park ride, right? And you still take advantage of the fact that you're part of the MCU, or not the MCU, but the overall Marvel universe.
Yeah, cool. I'm going to jump to the chat for a question really quickly, because Andy had a great question here that I wanted to throw up here, which is, with your success with lower budget films using found footage, have you tried taking these same techniques to other media or even other genres with this new project?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Black Velvet Fairies is, in essence, kind of a found footage podcast, right? Not in the sense of you find Lucy's audio recordings buried under a house that supposedly didn't exist, but in terms of it being a record of a thing that supposedly happened. Absolutely. So Black Velvet Fairies absolutely takes a found footage approach to this part of the story, which is what we found so appealing, right? It's this very much rooted in this world. Found footage kind of has that connection to reality, and then we use that connection to earthly reality as like a stepping off point to get you into the fairy realm, right?
So it is a portal fantasy in many respects.
Oh, 100%. Absolutely. The kids literally travel through a portal to get to yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm going to jump into another question about how do you choose and shape settings to kind of enhance the horror intention in your projects? Because like Blair Witch chose like some woods that like theoretically shouldn't be that scary. They're in a very populated area, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
What factors guide your selection of specific locations, like where in the real world to make that jumping off point into the fantastic?
Right, right. Well, with Blair Witch, I think, again, you're kind of tapping into so much lore that people know, right? That's one of the reasons that Blair Witch worked, is I think everybody walks around with some sort of witchy folklore in their head somehow, whether it's something local like the Bell Witch, like where we grew up, or just general awareness of, oh, back in the day in the colonies, people thought they were witches and they burned them at the stake, right? That's a super common story.
Mm-hmm.
With Blair Witch, Ed was from Maryland, mid-Atlantic, original colony. That setting alone kind of taps into that, right? So that felt very natural, right? And it fit with the lore. With Emerald Anvil, which is not really, Emerald Anvil overall is definitely not horror. Overall, Emerald Anvil is fantasy. But Black Velvet Fairies is a supernatural thriller mode, rabbit hole into the overall Emerald Anvil world. So with Emerald Anvil, I live in Portland, Oregon. The story kicks off, the story of the novel, Journey to Hada, kicks off in Portland and is set in Portland originally before they go to Hada. But Oregon definitely, and this was an influence on me and my kids. This is an idea that I've had for like 10 years, 12 years, started when my oldest kid really liked Tinkerbell. And I created my own fairy character for them to interact with and did like little interactive stuff for them, burying things in the backyard and writing little letters and things. But being in Oregon, to go to your question about setting or locations, Oregon kind of has a fairy-ish feel about it, right? Like you go for walks in the woods here and there's these giant trees covered in moss and it's very green and very emerald. That was like definitely an influence on me. So I think as a world builder, as a storyteller, you're kind of writing what you know, right? You're taking in data, influence from the outside world and trying to funnel that into your creative expression. So being in Oregon was kind of a starting off point for this kind of fairy-like world. I think horror is interesting because a lot of times, you look at horror and there are definitely settings that lend itself to horror, right? Woods,
creepy old house,
houses, right? Haunted houses, any place where you're isolated, right? But in terms of like choosing and shaping a setting to enhance horror is all about disrupting the norm, right? Horror is about I'm a family and I have a daughter and suddenly my daughter starts acting weird and oh my gosh, it's the devil, right? You're disrupting the norm of the family. Or I'm on a spaceship and I'm just a space trucker and oh my gosh, there's an alien on my ship and now the alien is disrupting my normal space trucker life, right? So I think any setting can be horror, right? Because horror is about the disruption of the setting, and a lot of what people try to do with horror is like, well, what do I find? What new normal can I find to disrupt?
Oh, that's really interesting. That's a really interesting angle.
Yeah.
That also kind of leads into the next question I was going to ask, which is you were talking about how like horror is the disruption of the normal, and fairy tales are sort of, or historically fairy tales have been around preservation of the status quo. Like originally fairy tales were deliberately frightening and meant as warnings to kind of maintain societal status quo.
Right.
So I'd kind of like to ask you, how do you bridge the gap between like this scary original purpose of fairy tales and modern fears and making that transition to like creating is it still about disrupting the status quo if you're taking that more horror angle, or is it more about like that warning of you know, I guess preserving the status quo or restoring the status quo.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting. Well, I would say, and I'm no expert on fairy tales, but I would say that there's fairy tales, uh, which I totally agree with you is like are typically warnings or moral tales to try to teach you about what you're not supposed to do or the consequences if you steal from somebody or take something that doesn't belong to you or whatever. Then there's literally stories about fairies.
Yeah.
So fairy tales that aren't actually fairy tales because a lot of times the fae, especially and John Cruise talks about this in Black Velvet Fairies. There's a version of a fairy in almost every culture, and they're not all like little winged beings, right? There's all different iterations of the fae or fairies or whatever. But the ones that we mostly know in the United States or most Western culture thinks about fairies as like English, British Isles fairies, right? That's mostly what we think about. And John Cruise's point when he's talking about it in Black Velvet Fairies is that the Fae were really dangerous, right? The Fae kind of represented this unexplainable part of nature, right? It was very much connected to nature. It was very much connected to the natural world. But the Fae were generally looked at as dangerous. They were not helpful. They were not nice. Like basically, if a fairy showed themselves to you, it's because they wanted something from you, and you had to be very, very careful. And you definitely did not want to fuck with the fairies, right?
Yeah.
And that's why he makes the point that in Ireland, where fairy lore is like super, super common, there were almost no witch trials because all the stuff that people blamed witches on, especially in the United States, they just blamed on the fairies. Right?
That's very interesting.
Something goes wrong with your kid or your milk spoils or all the weird shit that they blamed on witches, especially in the colonies. The Irish just blamed it on fairies, right? So you weren't trying to hold some poor woman accountable for the stuff. You said it was the fairies. So there are cautionary tales, but just I think in a different way. And with Emerald Anvil, what we're trying to tap into is this idea of fairies being dangerous and interacting with fairies being dangerous on this world. But then when you get to their world, they're even more dangerous because they're just as evil and fucked up and violent as humans. They just have powers that to us seem magical, on top of having psychological problems.
Psychological problems, phenomenal cosmic power, probably not the ideal combination.
Exactly.
For peaceful coexistence with humankind. I'm actually going to take that as an opportunity to jump back to my first question, which I actually skipped because I had more interesting ones. But this is actually a really good place to ask: how do you define folklore, urban legends, and dark fairy tales, and what are the common threads between these different things, and what are the significant differences?
Wow. You should have.
I don't pitch any softballs.
Sent me that one before so I could study this and sound like I know what I'm talking about. Folk horror seems like it's a pretty broad category. There's stuff like The Wicker Man, which is undoubtedly folk horror. That is absolutely tapping into folk tales and paganism and all that kind of stuff. Is about as folky as you get. A lot of people consider Blair Witch folk horror. So you would think, since I helped make Blair Witch, that I would know what folk horror is.
I was talking with Andy, who's in our chat yesterday, about folk horror and everything, and he's in the UK, and I'm from Appalachia basically, and we're like, British UK folk horror is you should have remembered the old ways, and the old ways never really went away, which is Wicker Man.
That's yeah.
And I was talking about Old Gods of Appalachia and things like that, and I was like, American folk horror is always informed by colonialism and immigration, and the message is always, you settled somewhere you shouldn't have, but you were kind of screwed where you were, so you're screwed either way.
Yeah, true. true. And that's Blair Witch. I mean, the underlying mythology of Blair Witch, if you like read the deep backstory, is that white people came to the United States, or the colonies at the time, and colonized and built a town in this place in Maryland that the Native Americans had stayed away from for centuries. They had never gone into that part of Maryland because there's fucking something in there, right? So Whitey comes in and builds a town where you absolutely are not supposed to build a town. So by that definition, Blair Witch is absolutely folk horror. I mean, I think the common thread is that they all are they're all warnings, right? In a way. I mean, urban legends are mostly about some sort of like classic urban legends, like alligators in the sewer, right? Like an urban legend. That's some sort of warning or some sort of way of instilling fear in a common everyday thing. A snake's going to come out of the toilet and bite your butt, or lots of serial killer things about watch out for people who are going to slice your Achilles tendon at the mall from under a car and pull you into a car, right? That's an urban legend. Yeah. Did it ever happen? I don't know. Satanic panic, right? The whole idea of, oh my gosh, every other childcare is really a satanic cult, and they never found one instance where that actually happened, and yet there were thousands of investigations because that urban legend had so much power, right?
Yeah, old school D&D players are very, very familiar with.
Oh, totally. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, although
math dice and Tolkien LARPing.
yeah, so dangerous and evil.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the common thread that I'm hearing in this is that that these three things have more in common with actual mythology than they do with what we typically think of as folktales and fairy tales. That it's kind of that man versus nature, that it's about the unknowable. Whereas folktales are more like, we know what the message of Little Red Riding Hood is very, very unambiguous. We know what the bad guy is there. It's the wolf, which is just code for, adult activities. But when you start getting into these legends and things like this is more about the things that are unknown and unknowable and things like that. And I think that's an interesting differentiator between what we typically think is maybe really close to the same thing. So I have another question from the chat. I just have to find it. Another question from Andy, and is there a fictional hub to all these stories and platforms that give the viewer something familiar to thread everything together? I think that's an interesting thing that you can speak to as far as the Emerald Anvil of it all.
Well, Emerald Anvil, the website itself is actually the hub, but we're not looking at anything as one central story that you have to go look at. And is there a fictional hub? Like a fictional hub within the stories themselves? Is that what he's asking? I'm not sure.
I think that's more what he's trying to get at.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, we're trying to look at it as trying to approach all the different media as standalone, so you can listen to the podcast and enjoy the podcast, and it doesn't matter if you interact with any of the other stuff. You can play the board game, which has a very deep storytelling element to it, and enjoy the game without knowing anything else about it. Same with the novel. The novel is definitely, it's a novel, so it's got more storytelling than the other stuff because it's one big giant story. But you can enjoy the novel and not know anything else. The NFT activation, which is called Battle for Hada, that one does a little bit depend on knowing about the rest of the world, because what we're doing with Battle for Hada is using NFTs to reverse engineer the world that the kids are being teleported to. So imagine, the game Risk, the board game Risk. So instead of 42 territories, you have 12,000. We take this fairy world of Hada, divide it into 12,000 hexes. You can buy one of those hexes and where you buy the hex, and then how you behave in this interactive story thing that we're going to do on Discord is literally going to create the borders and the power and the relative strength of all the fairy kingdoms in this world. And that's the world that the kids are teleported to.
So it's really a massive, massive world building project, is what I'm hearing.
An interactive world building project where you are participating directly in that part of the world building, and it's going to be a canon. It's going to be part of the universe forever. It's going to be canon storytelling. Everything that happens in Battle for Hada is going to be written. We're going to do a gazetter. I don't know if you remember the Greyhawk gazetter from back in the day, OG Dungeons and Dragons stuff. We'll put out a gazetter that's basically going to be a record, a written record in kind of the language of Hada, as if it's a historical document from Hada that's going to memorialize the actions of the players. So the stuff that you're doing in this interactive storytelling game is going to build the history and the lore of this world, and we're going to make it a canon part of the universe.
That seems like a really good use for World Anvil, if I'm...
I'm sure there is lots of things that you do.
Gotta get that pitch in there. So yeah.
World Anvil.
Okay, cool. This is not a question. I just wanted to throw it up here because you were talking about the fairies being kind of scary and terrifying. From the cartographer Elysium said, my favorite piece of knowledge about Iceland is how they use the fairies as an excuse to reroute an entire highway. No, you can't build the highway on that hill. It's a fairy hill, and we're not messing with that.
That's awesome. That is really cool. I think
engineering around fairies.
That is super cool. And actually, we pull some Icelandic stuff into all the fairy kingdoms, because part of the lore is that Hada, this fairy world, and Earth has been interacting for centuries and centuries, secretly, right? But interacting. So all the different dominions, all the different fairy kingdoms of Hada kind of reflect different areas on Earth, right? And so the main dominion that the kids get teleported to is called Aga, and there's a lot of Icelandic stuff in that. It's like Icelandic and kind of British Isles smashed together because they have such a strong fairy tradition.
Very cool. I'm going to jump to another question here. So folklore often serves as reflections of societal fears and anxieties. How do you create stories that tap into like the current zeitgeist? Are there specific, and horror especially, are there specific themes or motifs that you find effective in doing this kind of world building?
Yeah, and that's very deep question. Again, I wish I should have thought about it before. I mean, look, Blair Witch specifically, that's the thing that we're known for. I think that what Blair Witch did in terms of like tapping into any sort of zeitgeist, any sort of like current thing that was happening, was I think part of why Blair Witch was so effective and blew up so much was like, it was just the cusp of the onslaught of video in our lives, right? Mm-hmm. Back then, 99, yes, people had camcorders, and yes, people recorded things and you watched them at home or whatever. But the whole thing of like everything being posted on the internet had not really started yet. But I think people saw that coming, right? I think people saw reality being through a show like Cops, right? Which I've always said was like probably one of the biggest visual filmmaking influences on Blair Witch was probably Cops.
Wow, really? That's
because before Cops, nobody had ever really seen something that was just like following somebody around with a camera, where you're not trying to hide the fact that the camera's there. There's a light on it. The cop is clearly interacting with the camera that's there. A lot of times it's really boring, but because they're a cop, there's always this expectation of danger. And then something happens like, oh my gosh, that's so crazy. And it's even crazier because it was kind of boring and real before, right? Blair Witch kind of took advantage of that. So I think
it's a disruption of the normal.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And I think that the zeitgeist part of Blair Witch was that there was a new visual language for what real was, right? Which was
Mm.
shaky and imperfect. Because you think about, most movies are all about composition and beauty and lighting, and it's
Hitchcock with the perfect angles
exactly,
and
it's like
yeah,
which I love. Obviously, I
and the
love
dolly zooms and
right,
yeah.
but it's not necessarily a reflection of reality. And what was happening with the video revolution, right? The video being in everybody's hands, and now like a million times more now. But at the time, which is kind of just the beginning of ubiquity of the video image and what reality was. So now you have a new, again, it's like that disruption thing we were talking about, right? You have a new idea of what represents reality, what visually represents reality. And Blair Witch comes along. It's like, oh yeah, this feels really real because it kind of looks like what I shoot on my video camera, and then really messed up horror things happen, right? And I think that's what made it effective. Um, zeitgeist. Right? I think as a horror filmmaker, I think if you're chasing the zeitgeist intentionally, you end up with cheese ball movies, right? Because you're like, oh, what's cool? Oh, chat rooms are cool. I'll make a horror movie about chat rooms, or virtual reality. It's horror and virtual reality, right? Oh, it's the zeitgeist. And those can work, but I think if you're chasing that zeitgeist, you're barking up the wrong tree, because I think it's kind of like one of those things, like by searching for it, you're never gonna find it, right? I think you have to just approach it honestly as a filmmaker or a storyteller, and the zeitgeist really should be what works for you, what motivates you as a storyteller, and have it be true for you. And then hopefully that truth translates to somebody else. But if you're out there looking for, oh, what's this thing that everybody's going to be into because it's the zeitgeist, I think that's the wrong path to take.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because I'm thinking about like Megan, which is the horror movie that came out that was clearly in response to everybody's anxieties and fears around
Sure,
AI. And
sure.
you're right, it absolutely does have that element of campiness and cheesiness. They kind of leaned into it and
Yeah,
embraced it.
100%. Yeah.
But you're right. I don't think you can play it straight if you're deliberately, if you're that transparently chasing after something that's that obvious, a one-to-one metaphor.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Also, Andy says, due to production times, I guess you'll always be behind the zeitgeist a lot of time, even if you try. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. I think it's kind of a losing battle, right? I think
Yeah.
you're chasing your tail, I think, to a certain degree. Now, look, if something in the zeitgeist, if something in the popular culture really keys something in you as a creator, as a storyteller, absolutely follow that. But to be like, oh, let me mine popular culture and come up with something to make a dark fairy tale about, I'm not sure that that's the way to do it.
Well, and I guess sometimes that can be a thread into like those deeper, more primal fears. It's like you pull on that thread of like, AI might be like being replaced, and the industrial revolution. Like there's deeper things that you can, like, if you start tugging on that thread, eventually you come to something that's more primal and universal and timeless. But yeah, I think it's interesting to point out that there's the risk of that is like you trade relevance for like automatically being dated if you go to too specific and too current, I guess.
If you're chasing it that way, because look, I think it all ties into all these things that we're talking about, myth, lore, fairy tales, legends, all that kind of stuff, are all usually some sort of connection or explanation or example of some unexplainable power. I mean, that's a lot of like early mythology, like with gods, right? Like Greek gods and Roman gods and all that kind of stuff were not necessarily good, kind, like trying to do good things for you. They were kind of fucked up.
Zeus
And
was a hot mess.
yeah. Oh, yeah, totally. So I think these are all stories about powers that you can't control, whether that's like a demon, or an AI, right? An AI is like, oh my gosh, there's this incredibly powerful thing that we can't control. I mean, Oppenheimer, my wife, when we first watched Oppenheimer, My wife was like, "That's a horror film." And really, Oppenheimer is a horror film. And he shoots it like a horror film. If you think about the bomb or nuclear fission as a monster or a demon, it's constructed almost exactly like a horror film. Oppenheimer is really just like the dark wizard who is like trying to figure out this demonic force and that he's about to unleash on the world. It's a horror story. So it's all about this unknown or unknowable power that you're afraid of, whether that's a demon or an atomic bomb or an AI.
Yeah. Bar none, my favorite monster to come out of the atomic age is Godzilla because, giant lizards stomping through metropolitan areas are never going to not be fun.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that even in like the Godzilla Minus Zero, like the practical, going back to more practical effects and more of a old school kind of approach, and it is scarier that. So, anyways, I'm going very far afield. So I took a hard left into kaiju. Sorry about that. There's always the risk that I will take a hard left into kaiju.
You know what? I'm down. I'm down. I mean, I was hugely influenced by, and I don't know how this goes to world building, but if we're talking about kaiju, for whatever reason, I grew up in a really small town when I was like 4 or 5 years old in Missouri. And I guess back in the day, right, like Saturday and Sunday mornings were the local affiliate got that time to put whatever they wanted on. That's why you ended up with a lot of like public domain, like Abbott and Costello and all that kind of stuff. It was basically public domain or really cheap content that they could just license and put on the local thing and sell ads against it. For whatever reason, when I grew up like 4 or 5 years old, so 70, 71, somebody at the local affiliate, probably in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, liked Ultraman. And I watched Ultraman every, I think, Sunday morning. I watched Ultraman. So I grew up with like thinking, oh, kaiju and Ultraman is just like normal stuff. And then you realize that back then, like hardly anybody was being exposed to Ultraman. I just happened to like some wacky guy in Cape Girardeau liked Ultraman, so I got to see it. So kaiju and that kind of world is like has always been in my head since I was a little kid.
Yeah. We're coming close to the end of our time now, so and we've come to the end of my questions because you did a very good job of like very thoroughly answering some pretty deep questions that I threw at you. I do want to ask you. We had talked before the stream started. You kind of gave me like a deep dive of kind of like the whole Emerald Anvil premise and concept and everything like that. So like as we're coming to the end, I want to give you the opportunity to like pitch that and just kind of like get everybody excited about this this world that you guys have built.
Yeah. So Emerald Anvil is the overarching name for a fantasy story world that is really centered on this planet of fairies called Hada. And there's been centuries of secret interaction between Earth and Hada.
So changelings and things.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's all supposed to be kind of like representative or a reflection of real fairy lore, right? Which was part of fairy lore was always like step into the fairy ring or interact with a fairy in the wrong way and they pull you into their world and you never come back, right? Getting pulled into Elfheim or the world of the Fae or whatever was generally not a good thing, but you went there and you never came back, or there was a danger that could happen. So we kind of take that, and the idea is actually that on this fairy world they have these devices that they call portals, and they can use those to project themselves to Earth, and they appear small, right? And they have wings, or they have energy that manifests in a way that looks like wings to us. So we have the idea that the Hadin, which is what they call themselves, are these little bitty beings that you interact with, and they can take you to their world. That's really what happens.
So that comes back to your Star Wars background of the tiny hologram of Leia.
It's a little bit hologram action. Yes, absolutely. If we want to, I'll connect anything I can to Star Wars. So they're little holograms. They're little, the Emperor appearing in your hand or whatever. So this happens for centuries. There ends up being, it's a whole planet, right? So you end up with, over centuries and centuries, 2 billion Hadim, 2 billion fairies, and there's 30, 40 million humans, 50 generations of humans that have lived on this fairy planet that have never seen Earth. So then about 150 years ago, this terrible thing happens called the reaving, caused by a human, destroys about a third of the planet, kills about a third of the Hadim. So obviously people are not real happy with humans. It's a 100-year genocidal war to try to wipe the humans out. Kind of a truce happens. You got 50 years of relative peace. And then the events in Journey to Hada, the novel, happen, which is Morgan and Orion de Leon getting teleported to Hada, and their arrival kicks off all these different prophecies amongst these different fairy dominions. Some of them are like, oh, these kids have come after this long span of not interacting with humanity. Now we can start the path toward paradise. And then others are like, well, the Antichrist just arrived. So kicks off another war that the kids are at the center of. So that's like the main storyline. And we're hoping that that's 9 novels. If we have success, we hope that that's 9 novels worth of storytelling that's going to take Morgan from she's 14 in the first novel to, we're hoping, like 10 years, 23, 24 of interacting with this world. Same with Orion. The podcast we're hoping is going to be 3 seasons. The first season of the podcast, there is a direct intersection between the story of the podcast and what is happening in the novel that, again, you don't have to know about it, but if you do know both, there'll be a scene and you're like, oh, I see the characters in the same place at the same time, and this thing happens, and the character in the podcast obviously sees it from a different perspective as the kids experience it. The board game Glim is like almost like a history book of like ancient Hada, which is like an archetype, almost like a tarot type approach. It's a dice game, kind of a deck building game that, again, there's a kind of a is it real, very loose is it real aspect of it, which is like, it was a game that the fairies played on Hada that humans found out about and brought back to Earth, and this is the earthly version of a fairy game. And then the NFT activation Battle for Hada I talked about earlier is literally inviting the audience in to participate in building the world, right? Doing the world building with us in a really meaningful way that we hope, again, in success, that we keep expanding the influence that people have on the story world. We want that just to be the beginning. So I think that's I'm not great at the quick pitch. That's about as quick as I can wrap the whole thing up, but that's what we're launching, and that's what we're trying to get a little momentum for right now.
That's great. It sounds like a really rich setting for a lot of different storytelling to take place, and that's kind of
what
we're all about here at World Anvil, is creating these rich settings that are just good places for stories to happen and things like that. So thank you so much, Gregg, for coming on board the stream and the podcast today, letting everybody ask you their crazy questions, letting me just like pick your brain about myth and urban legends and folklore and all this crazy stuff. So just want to let everybody know in the chat, as far as our other announcements go, March is Unofficial Challenges Month at World Anvil. Check it out. We have a post on the blog about all of the different unofficial challenges that are going on in the community right now. We've also got Adventure April coming up next month, which is going to be a good opportunity for people who like to write one-shots and also people who like to write short stories to kind of write something around the theme of adventure and earn a cool badge for it. And we've just got a lot of stuff going on in the community. It's also time for our World Anvil World Building Awards, WAWA, as we call them. Everybody has been throwing their nominations, they're throwing their hats in the ring and getting votes and things like that. We'll be wrapping that up fairly soon to see the absolute best world building that's going on World Anvil. So there's very cool stuff going on, and I want to once again thank Gregg for being here. I always put my hands on the wrong direction because I can never remember that the camera reverses. So thanks a lot for being here, and we really appreciate you. And everybody, I guess you know what to do. I'm not Janet, but I guess you guys know what to do. Grab your hammer and go world build.
Thanks, Kat.
Thanks a lot. I have